Hello everyone, this is Dr. Stevens with a continuation of our study of Victorian poetry. We're going to be looking at two poems by Matthew Arnold. Before we get started, let me point out that picture. That is a picture of Dover Beach, the actual Dover Beach, which is the setting for one of the Arnold poems we'll be looking at. And Dover Beach is on the southeast coast of England. So we'll be looking at two poems, and we'll be looking at them in the context of Victorian agnosticism or religious doubt. So let's get started. What's in this lecture? Again, the general area that we're studying here is the poetry of the Victorian era. You have already seen some of that poetry by Tennyson. We've already looked in discussion at poems by Browning, Christina Rossetti, Jared Manley Hopkins. So that's the general context here. So we'll be looking at two poems then by Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach and Stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse, and these are poems, as I say, that are assigned for this unit of the course, the Victorian era. And what I want to do, though, before I look at the poems themselves, is to look at the context. And the general context I'm setting for these poems is what I am calling Victorian doubt. Now, I'm not going to have time to give you a detailed reading of the poems, although what I say about them might seem more detailed to you than it does to me. But especially Stanzas from the Grand Chartreuse, it's a very long poem, and there's no way I would have time in this lecture to go through line by line and stanza by stanza. So what I hope to do is, first of all, give you this context for the poems, and then do a relatively brief introduction of the poems themselves. But we need to back up a little bit and look at what we mean by this word Victorian. Victorian here applies to the Victorian era in English history. And traditionally we give this period the dates of the reign of Queen Victoria. She is still the longest reigning of all of the English monarchs. She reigned from 1837 to 1901. It seems as though the current queen, current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, might challenge the longevity of Queen Victoria, but she dominated this particular era. She gave this era her name. And very briefly, first of all, note the dates, because Arnold's poetry comes right in the middle of this period. And it's important to note that. This period comes immediately before what we might think of in general as our own contemporary period, that is the 20th century, and then now, of course, into the 21st century. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, first of all, the British Empire, the most extensive empire that has ever existed, the British ruled lands all the way around the globe, giving rise to that expression that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Ruled large sections of Africa and Asia, as I'm sure that you know. And so wherever the sun was shining, there would be a piece of the British Empire. So the British, during the 19th century, were the most powerful country on earth. During this period, we saw the rise of industry and industrialism, that is, an economy that's based on the factory rather than on agriculture. We saw the rise of what we think of as modern science, the rise of the middle class, which now dominates world cultures all around the world, and especially for our purposes here, the rise of religious doubt, that is, questioning the old truths that had always been captured in religion and in religious culture. Religious culture dominated human culture in Europe at this time. But now we are seeing a major change from a culture that is governed in terms of its values and beliefs by religion, moving from that to a non-religious or secular culture. And we see this movement then in the poetry that we're looking at right now, the poetry of Matthew Arnold. What do we mean then by this shift from a religious culture to a secular culture? Let me put that up here so that you remember this. Religious culture, what we mean is human culture that is dominated by what religion believes and values. And we're moving to a secular, and in a secular culture we do not mean that there is no religion, and certainly we don't mean that there aren't many people who believe in what religion offers and in what religion values. But the dominant thinking is secular thinking, and I think you'll understand this as we go along. Secular thinking in particular becomes dominated by what we think of as science. The word science, by the way, originally means simply knowledge. For us, science means that kind of knowledge that we gain by observing the natural world, experimenting with it, measuring it, and coming up with facts and theories about it. So, for example, the scientific theory of evolution, and it is a theory that's based on observations of the natural world. The theory of evolution challenges the prevailing idea. Now, this means the idea that prevailed at the beginning of the 19th century, that creation, that is the created world, the material world, or the physical world, is fixed. It's the same. It's always been the same. It's the same as it was during that 6-day period described in the book of Genesis when God created it. And it doesn't change. It never has changed. This is the prevailing view that is given in the, what I'm calling the religious culture of the time. Focusing upon creation, the idea was that the world was the way God had made it, had not changed. Now, scientists, especially, for example, Charles Lyell, a geologist, all right, scientists, in observing the natural world or the physical world, had discovered that, in fact, the earth changes. Charles Darwin, in Origin of Species, had proposed the theory that not only does the earth change, but living organisms change as well. Origin of Species, right here in the middle of our period, in the middle of the Victorian period, 1859. So science has begun to challenge one of the mainstays of the Christian view of the world, that the world is as God had made it and it would always be this way. And science is coming along and saying, well, maybe not. This, of course, becomes one of the underpinnings of what I'm calling religious doubt, if you can say that doubt has any underpinnings at all, right? So what we're experiencing is a revolution in Western thought, beginning with the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment goes all the way back to the 17th century. We are in the 19th century, right? The 1800s, 19th century after the birth of Christ. So we are now in the 1900s, I mean in the 1800s, but in the 17th century, beginning in this period, about 200 years previously, there is the beginning of this revolution in Western thought that we call the Enlightenment. The period of the Enlightenment was based on several tenets. We're going to look at two of the foundational ideas or concepts of the Enlightenment. And number one, reason replaces revelation as the basis for human knowledge. We are looking at knowledge that is derived through reason, and especially reason applied to observed data. That is what we can see, observe, measure in the world around us. This contrasts with knowledge that comes through revelation and I should put this in quotation marks, and what Enlightenment thinkers thought of as superstition. Second tenet, related to the first, is the rejection of the miraculous and the supernatural. Especially the central mysteries of the Christian faith, the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the miraculous events that are at the center of the Christian faith now are being questioned by reason. And belief in these things, belief in miracles, belief in supernatural, belief in God intervening in human affairs was now considered during the Enlightenment as superstition. So what about knowledge? The Bible is revealed truth. It is knowledge that is revealed to human beings through the men who wrote the scriptures, that is, the prophets. And then, of course, the writers, the apostles, and so on, the writers of the New Testament. So, what the Enlightenment has done is started to question knowledge that is considered to be divine revelation, and the only knowledge now that is trustworthy is knowledge that is based on observation and experience. So this revolution then in a theory of knowledge. Revealed knowledge is out, science is in. Reason and empiricism. That is ideas, knowledge, truth that can be arrived at through reason and that can be arrived at empirically. Empiricism simply means observation and measuring. And then, of course, being tested in the laboratory and so on. That is, scientific knowledge is knowledge that is empirically based on observation. Eventually, this leads to what we know today as agnosticism. Now, Thomas Henry Huxley was a scientist. He was also a very important science writer in the mid-19th century. Okay, again, the period that we're looking at and reading about in the literature that we're studying here. Excuse me. Agnosticism. Huxley coined the word agnostic. Gnostic simply means knowing. Agnostic means without knowledge, hence unknowable. Now, we're not talking about scientific knowledge, we're talking about religious knowledge. Huxley proposed that the only knowledge that we can trust, the only knowledge on which we can base any kind of belief or faith, is that which can be tested, as we say, scientifically. So, God's existence, the miracles, these are things that we cannot test scientifically. Huxley is not saying that God doesn't exist. He is not even saying the miracles are not true. He is saying that because they cannot be tested, we have no solid basis for believing them to be true. So there is no basis for religious belief. Now, we have to understand this, and this is the reason that I've spent so much time looking at this revolution in Western thought. We have to have some idea of this agnosticism, religious doubt, if you will, in order to understand where Matthew Arnold is coming from. So, let's have a look. Conclusion, as I say, because of this questioning of received truth, religious truth, and so on, we have this phenomenon that I'm calling Victorian doubt, and we mean religious doubt. It is expressed in the poetry of Tennyson, whom we've already read, especially in his In Memoriam. We've read some selections from In Memoriam. It is seen in Browning's poem that we also read, Caliban upon Setebos. Now, Setebos is Caliban's god. Caliban is the monster in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and Setebos is his god. And what Caliban is doing in this poem, long monologue by Caliban, he is questioning the nature of God, who God is, and what God is like, the character of God. And this is something then that the Victorians started to do. They started to question the nature of Scripture. They started to question the nature of God himself. These questions became open to people precisely because of this Victorian doubt. And we see it then throughout Arnold's poetry in the poems we're going to be looking at now, Dover Beach and Stanzas from the Grande Chartreuse. So let's get started. Dover Beach. Again, check out that picture, because that's where the speaker in the poem is standing. He's standing on this beach in the southeast coast of England, and he begins by saying, well, before we look at what he begins by saying, let me point this out. It is a lyric poem, and here, just as a context in which to understand the poem, look at the poem as expressing what it feels like to watch the death of faith. All right, not just religious doubt generally, but what it feels like to a person who has been born in a world that is thoroughly Christian, but then has grown up being taught that he should challenge that faith. And so it begins, of course, with the setting, Dover Beach. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast, you can look across the English Channel. I should have mentioned that Dover Beach. The ocean there that you see in the picture is the English Channel between England and France. So you can look across and you can see the light on the coast across the way. By the way, the English Channel is at its narrowest at Dover. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay, and you can see some of those cliffs in that picture. Come to the window. He seems to be talking to somebody, right? Sweet is the night air. And then, make a little transition here, only from the long line of spray, where the sea meets the moon-blanched, that is, made white by the moon-blanched land. Listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand. All right, this is the surf, rolling in and out on the beach there. Begin and cease, okay, the pebbles begin and cease and then begin again. With tremulance cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Now sadness plays a key role, not just the sound of the surf, but then the sadness of the experience of losing faith. All right, so of course this is the sound of the surf, and that sound is a sad sound. He contrasts the past versus the present. Sophocles, long ago, in the 5th century BC, the great playwright Sophocles, who wrote Antigone and Oedipus and other great tragedies, Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. All right, so this is the Aegean Sea, is the sea around Greece. And what Arnold is imagining is that Sophocles heard the sea. And he heard that sadness of the surf on the beach. And he's imagining that it brought to Sophocles' mind the ebb and flow of human misery, hence tragedy. We, in the present, some 1,500 years later, find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. All right, so he's up here in the North Atlantic versus the Aegean Sea, contrasting the past and the present. And so what is that thought? Let's see. Oh, right, this thought here that we're talking about, all right? Sophocles found a thought, and we find a thought, and so the question now is, what is that thought? The sea of faith. Okay, we're shifting. We begin with the literal sea, the ocean, on the English Channel. We begin with the literal sea, and we move to a metaphorical sea. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. What's this? Okay. First of all, the sea was at high tide, the sea of faith. All right, just as the tide would be high at Dover Beach, so at one point the tide of faith was high, and it was full, and it was like a bright girdle that is a band around the earth. All right, so it shone with life. But now all he hears is the sea of faith withdrawing. The tide of faith is ebbing, it's going out. And so it's as if this sea were on the metaphorical shingles, that is, pebble beaches of the world. All right, the beaches of faith, if you will, and the tide of faith is withdrawing. It's getting low. So he ends the poem with the question, what are we to do? If faith is receding, if it is diminishing, what are we to do? He says, well, first of all, love. It sounds again like he might be talking to someone. Perhaps someone he loves. All right, we don't know. Perhaps a woman. He doesn't say, but he seems to be addressing somebody and saying, let us be true to one another, as if that's all we have left. For the world which seems, that is, it appears, to lie before us like a land of dreams, meaning the world can still be promising, right? It still looks as though it promises something. So various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light. Seems to promise these things, but they're really all gone. Nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. This is life in today's world. Without faith to keep us together, we are only ignorant armies. And the darkling plain would be a field, a battlefield, all right? In the dark. Darkling means in the dark. So remember this poem, because the poem is a statement, first of all, of the disappearance of certitude, that is the kind of certitude that religious belief, and not only religious belief, but the foundation for human culture that religious belief brings. The certitude of those beliefs now has disappeared. The world that religion made is disappearing, and we are now on the beginning of the secular era. So we look at Arnold's poems about 1855, about the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the Victorian period, up until 1900. This is when this change is taking place. Religious faith is being replaced by religious doubt. In conclusion, then, let's have a look at Stanzas from the Grande Chartreuse. Now, in length alone, this poem is much more challenging than Dover Beach, which is a relatively short poem. So, to give it a context, to give you the overview, so you might have some context in which to relate the individual stanzas. First of all, the poem describes a visit to a Carthusian monastery, a religious order, a Catholic religious order, which actually exists in the Chartreuse Valley in France. Arnold himself actually made a visit to this monastery. He describes the visit quite extensively in the opening stanzas of the poem, and then in the poem he meditates on the contrast between the faith he finds in the monastery and his own religious doubt. So in general, as difficult as it can be from time to time, that's really what's happening in this poem. Arnold is engaging in a meditation on the contrast between the faith he finds in the monastery and his own religious doubt. All right. The world of the monastery is the old world. Religious doubt, folks, is not the new world. It is the world in transition. Arnold is not announcing the world that we have today because, of course, he does not know yet what is going to replace the world of faith. But he is struck with the fact that in this monastery, which in his time is about 800 years old, he is struck with the fact that here is a culture from the past that still believes in these old truths of the Christian religion. And he's struck with the contrast then between what he has come to know and to question, and what the monks themselves believe. Now, this comes in, I want to look at this because this is quite a ways into the poem. It's about a third of the way in. Lines 61 and following, he gets to what I call the topic sentence of the poem. So he writes, if you look at line 61 and so on, you can find this passage. Those halls, too, destined to contain each its own pilgrim host of old, from England, Germany, or Spain, are all are before me. I behold the house, the brotherhood austere. These are the Carthusian monks, right? And what am I? That I am here. Again, this announces that sense of contrast that I mentioned in the previous slide, all right? So Arnold has finished describing the setting, and here he is in the setting. Now, the setting is this Roman Catholic monastery. He's been noticing things that they do at the monastery, such as observing hours of prayer. It's a religious house. It is an organization, if you will, that is dedicated to prayer and praise, to study and work. These are the foundational principles of monastic orders, all right? Christian monasticism. A monastic order, a monastery, is a place of prayer and praise, study and work. And it has been now for centuries. All Christian monasteries. So the context then of this topic sentence is the Christian faith. Now, this is the sentence. What am I that I am here? And then he goes on in the rest of the poem to attempt an answer. He thinks about it. He meditates on that question. And I'm not sure he ever comes up with a very clear answer. It's the question itself that's important. Now, we've already looked at Victorian religious doubt. We've looked at the role of science and agnosticism. The point here is that Arnold has been influenced by this. He has been influenced by these new scientific thinkers, such as Lyell and Darwin and Thomas Huxley. And so he cannot go back to that world that is represented by the Grand Chartreuse, by that monastic order. So what am I that I am here? Well, first of all, rigorous teachers seized my youth. These would be the modern teachers, the teachers of the new science. Seized my youth and purged the faith of youth and trimmed the fire of youth. All right? These new teachers, not religious teachers, but what I'm calling here, for sake of convenience, scientific teachers, showed me the high white star of truth. There bade me gaze and there aspire. Even now their whispers pierce the gloom, the whispers of these rigorous teachers, right? He hears them, right, in his conscience, in his mind, saying, what are you doing here? What dost thou in this living tomb? The monastery is a living tomb. And what is buried in the monastery? The dead religion. All right, and this, by the way, lines 67 and following. Does he find an answer to the question? Well, let's look. Forgive me, masters of the mind. Right? The mind is reason. And these masters were the rigorous teachers, at whose behest I long ago so much unlearnt. What did he unlearn? Those religious truths. So much resigned, that is, gave up. What did I give up? I gave up the certitude of my religious faith. I come not here to be your foe. All right, he's not opposing the masters of his youth, the teachers. He says, I seek these anchorites, these are the monks, not in ruth, not out of sorrow or remorse over what you have taught me. I have not come here to curse you or to deny your truth, he says. Okay, first of all right, what am I? Well, I'm not going back, he's saying. I'm not going back to that old religion. But I am trapped. In other words, the new science has not for him become a new religion. It's not something that he has been liberated into. He says, not as their friend, that is the monks, or child I speak, but as on some far northern strand, thinking of his own gods, a Greek in pity and mournful awe might stand before some fallen runic stone, for both were faiths, and both are gone. And he's referring now, I'm not going to go into detail, but he's referring to religions that are now dead, just as it seems as though his own religion is dead. So he is now wandering between two worlds, the world of faith, one dead, and that's, of course, the Christian religion, one dead, the other powerless to be born, with nowhere yet to rest my head. Like these on earth I wait forlorn. Their faith, my tears, the world deride. I come to shed them at their side. So he is wandering. Two worlds. One world is clear. It's the world of the Christian faith. The other world powerless to be born. He does not know what world he is entering yet. It has not been defined for him. And it seems powerless. It is not, it can't even be born. So his faith is dead to him, but there is nothing yet to take its place. And let's see, what did I note the... Oh, yes. If you're looking for this in your book, it's here, lines 79 and following. That's where you can find this. All right, to wrap this up, the answer again, continuing with his answer. So give me and those like me permission to mourn. Again, he's addressing the teachers of his youth. For the world cries, your faith is now but a dead time's exploded dream. My melancholy sciolists, and sciolists are superficial thinkers. I think you have a footnote to that effect. My melancholy thinkers say is a past mode, an outworn theme, as if the world had ever had a faith, or sciolists been sad. But if you cannot give us ease, last of the race of them who grieve, here leave us to die out with these, last of the people who believe. Okay? Give me permission to mourn with these monks, silent while years engrave the brow, silent. The best are silent now. The best are no longer making any claims for truth. They are silent. Lines 97 and following, if you want to look that up in your text. So who are those who grieve? We are like children reared in shade, and this here is a metaphor for the culture of religion. We are like children raised in shade beneath some old world abbey wall, forgotten in a forest glade, and secret from the eyes of all. Deep, deep the greenwood round them waves, their abbey and its close of graves. That's simply an area. It's an old-fashioned use of the word close to mean an enclosed area like a cemetery. So this is their surroundings. He concludes by making reference to the banners of action and the bugles of pleasure, and this is last stanza, lines 205 and following. Fenced early in this cloistral round, that's the abbey, of reverie, of shade, of prayer, how should we grow in other ground? How can we flower in foreign air? Pass, banners, pass, and bugles cease, and leave our desert to its peace. Again, the question, and he really never does answer the question, what now? All he can, what his answer consists of is the request for permission to live in this doubt. We cannot grow in other ground. All right, we, that is, the people of Europe, if you wish, including those monks, those French monks in the valley of the Chartreuse, all right, we grew in this world that's represented by the monastery. That's the world we grew in. How can we grow anywhere else? He doesn't know yet. That world to come is still foreign. How can we flower in foreign air? Pass, banners, pass, bugles cease, and leave our desert to its peace. It's a desert because it no longer has faith, but that faith has not been replaced with anything else. That's all for now, folks. I realize this is challenging material. I invite your questions and your comments, so I will see you online in discussion.